Don't look at me like I'm crazy. People are waiting for the video. Look at what you're doing. You're looking all cute sitting on that ottoman with the little fuzzy top. It's hard to get anything done around here. Hi everybody, my name is Danie and welcome back to my channel, The Diaries of DIY Danie, where I solve home decor dilemmas with a DIY. Today's video is part 2 of my journey with Jenny Lynn, who is the owner of Fusion Mineral Paint. She asked me to come in and help her make over her studio space with a bunch of amazing DIYs. You probably saw the first video where I made over her rusty radiator and I turned it into this beautiful pink ombre. It was positively radiating. Get it? And if you haven't watched that video, I have linked it here. This time, I'm going to be creating a live edge epoxy resin table. And of course, I wanted to do something kind of unique with it. Something that would speak to Fusion Mineral Paint as a company. So I added a small element on the side that I am excited to share. So stay tuned because this project is kind of just cool. And of course, before we get into it, if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. I love the support and I love to create a community of DIYers who also love doing what I do. So let's stop gabbing and get into it, shall we? Roll the tape. So the first step to making my DIY live edge board was get the live edge board.
God, hope there's no traffic. Oh, I hate traffic.
I got super lucky because Jenny Lynn owned a piece of live edge board that she wanted to work with. So all I had to do was just get there and pick it up.
There it is, guys. How gorgeous is that?
I must say the piece was a beautiful maple live edge. It had so much character, had knots in it and like old holes kind of rotting through it that looked so beautiful. The bark looked intact. This was a really great piece to start working with.
I am excited about this.
Even though there were a lot of issues with it that I hadn't even seen coming. So let me show you what my plan was. My goal was to find a way to incorporate the mineral paint into the epoxy. So when somebody walked in the room, they were like, oh my God, how did you get that color? Jenny Lynn would say, oh, those are my paints.
Ooh.
So I started whipping up a whole bunch of ideas that I thought would be really cool. And these ideas were really cool. I had one really cool idea where you could take dipped paint brushes and it would be set into the epoxy. Hello, that's super cool. I thought about a paint palette and how that could be incorporated onto a wood board. Of course, I had just made over her radiator in this beautiful pink ombre, so I kind of thought maybe if I stayed within that realm and go minimal and try to create the ombre look with simple stripes on only one side of the board. We picked the stripes. It was the winner and I had a plan to move forward with. Hooray! Making plans. If you don't have a plan when you're DIYing, that's just chaos. Madness, I tell you! Before I started anything on this board, my goal was to just play with the epoxy and become a little bit more confident with it. Because honestly, I was kind of afraid of it. You know, I've never used it before. And I talked to a bunch of people who told me you really just have to get your feet wet and keep doing it over and over and then you'll get better. We're playing with epoxy, epoxy. We're playing with epoxy. Clearly don't play the guitar. Anyways, normally to add color to epoxy, the usual way to do this is with tints or some kind of colored mineral. But in this case, I was using an acrylic paint. I did some research online and they said that mixing with acrylics was okay, but I definitely wanted to do a few test runs just to find out before I actually put it onto my main board. And I'm glad I did because I kept letting the board dry and it kept coming out sticky. I didn't end up filming the sticky part, but I can tell you it did not come out right. And apparently this stickiness is quite normal if the epoxy isn't thoroughly mixed or if you put something that is stopping the epoxy and the hardener from working together. Essentially, that's what this acrylic paint was doing. I wasn't feeling very confident at this point. I mean, I retried this process about 3 more times, which I didn't show on camera. So I ended up going to a local expert. Our dialogue went pretty much like this.
You want to do what? add acrylic paint?
Yeah, I want to add acrylic. I saw this person online and they said that you can add acrylic and it shouldn't ruin the epoxy in any way.
You found this person on the internet?
Yeah.
Do you do everything people tell you to do on the internet?
Well, like, no.
You can't mix acrylic with epoxy.
But this person seemed like a pretty trusted source.
Well, obviously not.
You
should be using a tint or a mineral.
Won't do that again. But with all seriousness, I told him that it was super important to me that I find a way to incorporate this paint on the board. And what he recommended to me was using gesso. Duh! Hello! It seems so freaking obvious. So what is gesso? Gesso is essentially a thick white substance that artists applies on their canvas before painting with acrylics so that the paint doesn't absorb into their canvas. It's basically like a primer for your canvas. Instead of adding the paint into the epoxy, I would line each channel with the gesso, then paint in the colors I wanted, and then pour in the clear epoxy on top.
Key with pouring epoxy is that it's always a 50-50 relationship. 50% part A, 50% part B. You can't mess that up. It's very important. We're dealing with science.
Another thing that the gentleman at the store recommended to me was to be in a really dry space. It is so crucial that you wait for each layer to dry. Crucial to the outcome of your board. If you don't, moisture is going to stay in there and it will affect the epoxy pour.
I'm feeling pretty confident that this is going to work.
So good! I was ready to move on to prepping my board. At that point, I was on my way to spend a week at my mom's.
I think if you're gonna DIY, you should do it in a place like this. You having fun, buddy?
Which was the perfect time to work on the body of the board because I had access to an entire wood shop, which was perfect because I had no idea what was coming. The horror! What was it? I'll tell you. Once I had time to really evaluate the board, I realized that I was faced with a few challenges. First challenge was that my board was cupped. Essentially what that means, it was doing a U shape, and normally that happens when your board has been exposed to humidity or conditions where it didn't dry uniformly on both sides. The second thing was my board had a twist in it at one of the ends.
It's not nice.
Basically, what this meant was I was screwed. I felt so far at a depth on how to fix this. So I called in the experts, and for me, that was Team Italian. Team Italian to the rescue. Or in my books, Team Super Mario Brothers. Woohoo! Team Italian consisted of my stepdad Vince and his brother Gino, and boy, were we ever a good DIY team that weekend.
This is the best way to DIY. Do it with experts.
The first step was to get that cupping out of the board. So we had to plane this board down. It was a chance to use a new tool that I had never used before, and I was excited to try it out. We set the planer between 1/16 and 1/8. As we started planing, that's when we realized that twist was far worse than what we thought it was. And there was just no way we could get a flat surface of any reasonable thickness. So we had to do something that I was trying to avoid. We had to cut the twisted side off.
Goodbye, rest in peace. Sweet, sweet board. However, this is gonna make a really great stool or some kind of shelf.
You're officially named repurposed.
This is looking much better though. I mean, it looks less twisted.
We cut off about 18 inches, leaving the table at 54 inches, which was a good size for a desk. Here's a cool tip. If you're using a planer, it drops off at the edge and it'll gouge your board. So you just need to make sure you're making nice, even strokes. With the worst part of the twist gone, we planed both sides, slowly eating away at the board, and we ended up with a board thickness of 1.5 inch. And boy, did we end up with a lot of sawdust that day.
Yeah, we kind of made a mess. Look at that.
At that point, it was getting kind of late in the day, so we clamped the board down just to avoid any more warping. And a cool trick that I learned from Team Italian was pouring water on the board, so it would dampen the board, but also help recorrect it a little bit. Also, here's what I love about working with Team Italian. By 5 o'clock, they're ready to quit and end their day with a lovely glass of wine. I didn't actually have wine in the house, so I'm drinking spritzy water. 24 hours later. Day 2, the board is dry. Is it warped? We will find out. We unclamped it and the twist wasn't as bad as we thought. It really did start to recorrect itself. I mean, it was still there a little bit, but it was working. Things were looking up for once in this project. At this point, we had to evaluate which side of the board was going to be the top and the bottom. Because there was that cupping on both sides, if we were to flatten it on both sides, we would have ended up taking so much wood away that we would have been left with like a ½ inch of a board, and that really wasn't thick enough to make a tabletop. We ended up going with the side that was more cupped, which ended up actually being the path of least resistance. To remove that cupped warp, what we used was something called a sled. What happens with the sled is that it sandwiches your board, and then a piece will sit on top, and this acts as your level guide as you're going across. So your router will fit inside it, and you're slowly taking the wood away 1/8 of an inch at a time. We were using a 3/4 inch router bit, and we just slid that piece back and forth and slowly started taking away the wood. So I did about 3 passes on the board before we got it level. You know that you're done when the router bit touches the entire top of the board. Hooray! We've been routed to the right direction. Go Team Italian! We did it! After we were done celebrating, we took a 36 grit sandpaper on a belt sander to remove the deep grooves in the board. And then as a last step, we just took a 50 to make it nice and smooth.
I have so much sawdust up my nose that my nose is starting to run.
Then, of course, we clamped it down again just to preserve that flatness, and we called it a day. This is the piece we cut off. Look at that. Look at the difference in thickness right there. I mean, it's amazing what happened to this board. It's completely transformed. It was one time. Day 3 of the board. The plan for the day was to create the channels that the ombre was going to live in. So we're gonna be using the router to cut out 6 lines that are gonna run down the board. To create a straight line, we simply just used a straight edge, and then we placed another board on the other side that was the exact width of the router guide. To set up our routing channels, we used a 1/4 inch router bit on a plunge router. Once I was finished drawing the first line, I actually used a 5/8 inch thick board to create the gap for where I wanted my next line to start. So essentially I used the board, drew the line out, moved everything up, and then just rinse and repeat. And I did that 6 times. Cool. And then as the last thing, I took a 1/4 inch chisel and squared out the ends so that it would be nice and clean. Look how cool that looks. Ah, that's gonna look so cool with the epoxy. It's a good day. Hooray! And then just called it quits for the day. Day 4. Guys, future Danie here. My hair is shorter, I know. Due to some unforeseen happenstances, I lost my footage. I wasn't able to show you guys how I attached the legs, so I'm using a fun visual because it needed to be explained. If you remember, we only ended up leveling out one side of the board. The bottom side still had a bit of a cup. So we traced the size of the leg onto the board and then routed out that entire section completely level so that the legs would be level and so would the desk. Future Danie, out. At that point, all we had to do was pack up the board, take it home, and I was ready to epoxy this baby. Woohoo! Like my test, the first step was to add the gesso into all of the channels and then let that dry for 24 hours. Once my gesso was dry, it was time to add the acrylic paint.
These are going to be my 4 base colors.
And mix up my ombre magic. I actually still had a lot of paint from the radiator project left over, so I was able to use it for my ombre board.
Pretty happy with all this, so now we can get painting. How cool is that? I mean, I know it's kind of hard to see right now because there's a bunch of white on the board and there's a bunch of color, but that will all get sanded away.
Okay, it was the big moment. The big moment. Time to epoxy. Ooh, ooh, ooh. I don't know why I'm dancing. I don't know why I'm dancing. I'm excited. I know. I'm weird. So the first thing that I did was take aluminum tape and covered up any of the open or exposed cracks so that the epoxy wouldn't just pour out. I learned this trick on the internet.
You do everything people tell you to do on the internet?
So I was praying to God that it actually worked because it would have gotten real messy. So I mixed up my epoxy.
This is professional pouring right here, people. Okay, big moment.
At that point, all I did was just pour the epoxy into my channels and any of the cracks in the board and used a plastic scraper to move all the epoxy around. Once you pour it, you have to wait 15 minutes, and then the best part of this entire process is that we get to use a blowtorch. So freaking cool. I took a blowtorch and I would apply that heat to all of the epoxy, and what that does is it removes all the air bubbles so that you're not left with air bubbles that are hardened inside. And I just went at her. It was fun.
This is the best.
See all those bubbles are just popping?
Woo!
That's what you want. You want those bubbles to pop?
Of course, my partner Jeff was with me while I was playing with fire indoors. Safety, people.
Yeah, see, that's what you want. Hit it, yeah, hit it with the heat, good. There you go, there you go, beautiful.
And, yeah, just kept stealing the show. You play with fire and the boys just gotta come and play, you know?
I wonder if blowtorching inside your house is covered under insurance. Seems to have all worked out, so pretty happy with that. She looks so good.
Once the epoxy was hardened, I was ready to start sanding. At that point, I just cleaned the board up. I used some tack cloth to really get into all of the edges of the live edge. And then essentially it was ready to start staining. The stain that I used was a live edge stain in a natural color, and that color looked beautiful. So good. And then I decided to do a top coat using a polyurethane. This was a satin finish, so it wasn't a high gloss and it wasn't a matte. It was kind of in the middle, just because I knew this was a desk. I knew it was gonna see a lot of action, a lot of wear and tear, so I just wanted to give it an extra coat of protection.
All looks good to me.
All that was left to do was add the legs and bring this desk back to Jenny Lynn's office. I was super happy with the final outcome, and it just looked so beautiful in that space. I loved that Jenny Lynn already had a few live edge benches, so it created a nice seat for the table. The natural stain made the table feel so warm in the room, and the extra coat of protection on the top provided a slight sheen that made it feel so elegant and eye-catching. Plus, I liked that the extra coat of polyurethane was able to really help protect the live edge bark on the edges. Okay, let's talk about those dark metal legs. They were the perfect material to contrast that natural wood on top. It gave the piece that beautiful industrial edge it needed to really complement the space it was in. They looked so sleek, the open lines made it feel kind of edgy without taking away from the most important part of the table, which was the live edge. But let's talk about the coolest part of this piece. Those colored epoxy channels. I knew they were gonna look awesome and complement the radiator, but it looked so good. It was just the perfect minimal pop on the table that set it apart from all the other live edge tables, and it really personalized it for the space. I'm just so happy we went with the minimal approach. So it was time to reveal to Jenny Lynn.
Oh, wow. Look at this. Wow, that's so cool. Isn't it so cool? It's gorgeous. Yeah, you happy? Oh yeah, it's beautiful. I just love this detail in here.
The project was a huge success. In terms of DIY difficulty, I am going to give this project a 5 out of 5 stars. This project was not for the faint of heart. I even had to bring in experts to help me. You know, I think I had a lot working against me having a cupped and twisted board. A lot of the times if you go out and get a live edge board, this will all be worked out for you, so you probably won't deal with the problems that I dealt with, but at the same time, it definitely wasn't easy. So I'd be interested to know if you guys have worked with epoxy resin out there. What kind of projects did you take on and was it successful? Please do share your advice and stories in the comment section below. I would love to hear. And let me know if you want to see more epoxy projects happen in the future. I am now one confident girl, so I'm ready to take on more. Thanks so much, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.